Brilliant. So this is Rob at Optimal Bodies. So this is a special moment because it's my first ever podcast, and we're very lucky to have a well-known face. Unless you've been in living under a rock, we've got Dr. Anthony Chaffee, and this is all about the carnivore diet, which you may be surprised. So you'll see this guy's face a lot on YouTube with a lot of all the shorts that come up and longer videos. So I wanted to have you as my first guest just because I've learned so much from you and wanted to thank you in person, or virtually.
Nice.
I'm an online coach, so I do a lot of diet plans for people that mainly just lifestyle stuff, but also like bodybuilding. People want to get really lean, and I've always gravitated towards using the carnivore diet because I discovered it myself through Sean Baker, which a lot of people did. And then I've watched hours and hours of your videos, like walking around, listening to your podcast and learning things. And then I implement that into my coaching. If I've ever got some sort of question or query about a client, I usually be able to find it in your content. So thank you for agreeing to do the podcast. And um, so those who don't know you, as I said, it's Dr. Anthony Chaffee. You're an American living in Perth, Australia. That's correct still?
Yeah. I'm traveling at the moment, but yeah, normally in Australia.
Yep, and you're a doctor of neurosurgery. Are you a registrar? Is that correct?
Yeah, I was a neurosurgical registrar up until last year or so, and or a year and a half ago, and I've taken over a metabolic health practice and focusing on preventative medicine, health optimization. Using a lot of diet and lifestyle interventions to affect the actual root cause of disease and actually get people better instead of putting them on more medicine. We're taking them off medicine, and that the plan is to still keep going with neurosurgery, but this just sort of happened just because the my friend was sort of forced into retirement, and he would have had to close down the practice, and people would have not had anywhere to go, so I didn't want to leave them in the lurch, so I sort of stepped in and took over that. So that's what I'm doing at the moment.
Brilliant. No, that's fantastic. And I know you've played very high level rugby. You've been into MMA, kickboxing sort of thing. So you're not just got like the health side. You've got a lot of like athletic background to you, so you can relate to a lot of athletes and sports performance. So that's why I thought I really wanted to speak to you about those
Mm.
sort of things as well. And obviously, you've helped probably in the thousands, whether it's be in person or just from people like relating to your content. And it's all based around like this optimal way of eating, which is all based around the carnivore diet. And it's as you've alluded to there, fixing the root cause of disease through diet rather than like medical intervention. As hopefully that's like the last resort, but you're
Mm.
treating these incurable autoimmune conditions, which you seem to have a lot of experience in that. So, did I get
Yeah.
anything wrong there, or anything
N-
you want to
No,
add?
no, it's I mean, just the thing that I would add to that is that we call these things incurable just because we haven't figured them out yet, but they have a cause. And if you understand the cause, then you can at least attempt to understand the solution. If you see that, okay, well, X is causing Y, okay, well, if you can do something about X, then that should affect Y. And so I think that's really what the carnivore diet does. I honestly do think that it addresses the root cause of autoimmunity. I don't think that our body is really just attacking itself because it's not capable of doing that. When I took postgraduate immunology in my undergraduate degree, it was very clear. It said, black and white in the textbook, your body can't do that. And when your immune cells are maturing in your thymus, they're tested against every single molecule that your body is capable of making. And if it reacts even weakly to them, they are killed so that there is no possibility of autoimmune attack. And then they go like, well, okay, what about autoimmunity? Okay, well, something must have gone wrong in that maturing process, and we don't know why. We don't know what the hell's going on. Okay, so that if they don't know what's going on, they don't know why that's happening, but we know that there's all these inherent checks against it happening. Are we actually sure that that is what's happening? We have autoimmune conditions like celiac disease that is called an autoimmune disease, but it's also known that it's mediated by gluten. Okay, well, what does that mean? Why does something have to be, if it's an autoimmune disease, if you're making antibodies towards yourself, why does it need to be mediated by something? Well, when you eat gluten, that gluten is a lectin, that's a plant toxin. Plants have toxins, millions of different, or about a million different toxins that plants make. And some of these things can be directly toxic, they can harm us in different ways. And there's a whole category of them called lectins that can, bind and stick to and attack our cells. And gluten is one of them. And so that's attacking our intestinal cells. And then the body does exactly what it's supposed to do, is it's supposed to attack that attacker, right? So defend your body. And so you make antibodies towards it. But we see this microscopically. It destroys the villi and the microvilli and causes all sorts of problems and malabsorption issues. People get very, very sick, but only when you're eating gluten. When you stop eating gluten, the problem goes away. And we actually see on microscope, on biopsy, that the villi and microvilli fully recover in 4 to 6 weeks, even though those antibodies stay elevated for over 3 years, usually, right? So you have these elevated antibodies. They're circulating in your body at all times, and yet they're not attacking yourself. They're not doing anything. So that's not an autoimmune disease. Your body's not attacking itself. It was attacking the gluten, which was stuck to your cell. So your cell got hit in the crossfire. And I think that's what's going on with other autoimmune diseases as well. I mean, we talk about molecular mimicry. Well, we have this virus or a bacteria or something that comes in, and our body attacks that. And then that antibody towards that thing is similar enough to your own cell that it attacks that too. But if you were capable of making an antibody that attacks something else that could cross react, your body's capable of making an antibody that could just react with your body in the first place. It wouldn't need molecular mimicry. So none of this stuff makes sense if you actually break it down and think about it. So I don't think that's what's going on. And what we're seeing when people go on a carnivore diet is they get rid of these lectins. They get rid of the gluten, but there's thousands of other lectins. It's not just gluten, and there are hundreds of thousands of other chemicals and toxins, and even hundreds of thousands more man-made toxins, things like glyphosate, which is on all of our produce items, and that is strongly associated with autoimmunity. And so when you're eating these things and they go into your body, you know, my theory is that they can attack your body, and your body can make a response to that and make antibodies towards it. Now, why do some people get it and others don't? I have no idea. So maybe there's something else going on as well, but that seems to fit a lot better than the current understanding of autoimmunity. And either way, when you do go on completely eliminate out everything else except meat and water, some people call it an elimination diet. I call it just eating to our biological design. But you get rid of these things that are not good for us, right? I mean, I should tell you that if you're on an elimination diet and you're eliminating all these things that are bad for you, shouldn't you just not eat them in the first place? Isn't that just like, isn't that just makes sense that like, oh, okay, well, maybe that's just not meant for us. I mean, koalas are on a complete elimination diet as well because they're not supposed to eat these other things. Lions are on a complete elimination diets also. It's just their diet. That's just their evolved diet. And so I think that's the same with us as well. And when you get rid of those things, we do see people's autoimmune issues go away, even though the antibodies can remain elevated. So you have people with Hashimoto's, when you measure their antibodies, and their thyroid function slowly improves because it's a slow growing, healing tissue, the thyroid. But you can see people's antibodies be elevated for over a year and a half, but they're slowly coming down because there's nothing for them to attack. And their thyroid function is improving that whole time. Or you have Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis. Again, your antibodies are going to stay up for years sometimes without any sort of something to attack because when it's involved in like a disease process and like an infection, it has to stay up, it has to stay elevated to have that immunity, that acquired immunity. So when you get another insult again, it comes back again, it's ready to go, bang. Right, because that's how your body deals with infections, and so you're going to see those antibodies stay up for a while, and they slowly come down, slowly come down, slowly come down. So things like Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, rheumatoid arthritis, those antibodies are going to stay elevated for over a year, years sometimes. But the damage reduces within weeks. People are getting much less symptomatic, and they're improving their symptoms dramatically. Okay, so that sort of lends itself to the theory that I put out there, which is we're removing the cause, and now those antibodies, even though they're in their circulation, they have nothing to attack. They're not worried about it, right? And and your body doesn't treat autoimmunity like an infection anyway. The idea is that your body is sensitized to your own tissue, and it thinks your own tissue is an infection or an invading something. And that's not how it acts. When your body has an infection or abscess or something, it ramps up your antibodies. It does a full court press and attack until that thing is dead. Either it's dead or you're dead, because those are the stakes. If you have an pneumonia, if you have an infection, if your immune system is completely depressed due to a specific condition or medications that you're on or chemo or something like that, people die from colds. They die from weird fungal infections that no one would ever get unless they had a depressed immune system. So it's not that would not be how your body attacks things, right? So if your body thought your thyroid was an infection, it would just not stop until that thyroid was dead. So you'd see, like in type 1 diabetes, the beta cells in the pancreas get completely wiped out, but there aren't that many of them, right? And so it could be that they're getting damaged along the way, but when we notice them is when it's at a critical point where we can't make enough and compensate for this, and so it's already been a long established issue. But things like thyroid, people can have Hashimoto's for years and years and years and years and years, and there's sort of ups and there's downs, and we measure the antibodies, and they sort of up here, and then they sort of go down here, and they're sort of up. So there's ebbs and flows. People have flare-ups and remissions of rheumatoid arthritis and Crohn's and things like that, and all of a sudden it's big in attack and horrible, and then all of a sudden it just sort of goes away and is okay, and then it comes back, and then it's okay. And we've seen diet modulate that with Crohn's disease. There's a study in humans where they took they just removed carbohydrates and fiber and saw how long people could stay in remission without medication. Some of them were staying in remission over 4 years without medication just by removing carbohydrates and fiber. Okay, so there's something in there that's triggering these things. So those antibodies are going to be elevated, and yet for 4 years for some of these people, there's no problem, right? And so that's not how infections act, like or your immune system acts towards infections. It's like if you just lay off an infection for 4 years, you're dead. So that's a faulty immune system. So I don't think that that's what it is, but I truly think that this is, and I see it behave this way, that that these sorts of diseases that we call diseases are not really diseases. These are from exposures and malnutrition. So we're exposing ourselves to things that are harmful to us, and we're not getting proper nutrition, and that's harming us. And we're not as healthy as we could be or should be. And so that's why I think this is addressing the root cause of things. Just because we don't know the cause doesn't mean that there isn't one, and it doesn't mean that we can't figure that out. And I honestly think that this is it, at least for a lot of them.
Brilliant. Thanks for all that. Which is good because my first proper question was about it, just in a nutshell,
Mm-hmm.
or an eggshell. What is the
Mm-hmm.
carnivore diet for people that haven't heard it? And you've massively gone down the rabbit hole of the plant toxin side. So basically, the things that we're not supposed to have in our system, which is great. Which that really explains that. So with rather than the molecular mimicry theory,
Mm-hmm.
are you alluding to that it's more of, say, like the lectin is directly binding to cells, and it's more of like a friendly fire, like a collateral damage sort of thing that's
Mm-hmm.
attacking your cell? Did I get that right from
Yeah,
that
exactly.
explanation?
Yeah, I mean that
Yeah,
certainly seems to be what we're seeing with celiac, and
yeah,
and the other autoimmune diseases behave in the same way as well.
yeah,
The gut heals very, very quickly, and so you'll see a rapid improvement, but other tissues not so much, and so you won't necessarily see that level of improvement that quickly, but it does happen. I mean, we're working on a paper now, that's a case series on people with multiple sclerosis. So it's an autoimmune condition that attacks the central nervous system. Some of these people are extremely debilitated, and some people are, wheelchairs and bedridden and having very serious issues. They go on a carnivore diet. They do, these things, and not only does that suppress the progression of multiple sclerosis, but we're actually seeing people with MRIs actually improving and reducing their lesions, or actually healing their lesions, because that's the other side of this. You're having a sort of a disease process because you're getting attacked, because you're bringing something in, your body's getting damaged by it. But on the other side of it is the malnutrition, where you don't have enough nutrients to build and run your body properly. Most people are B12 deficient, even though they don't realize it. We say that above 150 picomoles per liter is normal, and below that is deficient. But Oxford University published a paper in 2008 that actually showed that people who had adequate B12 and no problems, they actually did MRIs every year for 5 years, and they found that the people below 308 picomoles per liter, so okay, 150 points above what is not deficient, and their brains were shrinking by 1% per year. So they shrank by over 5% after 5 years. Their brain shrank, right? So that's a clear critical deficiency that is causing brain damage. The reason that we say above 150 is normal is because that's the general accepted average. And so, in fact, you will see differently in Australia and America and UK, everywhere. You're going to see different reference ranges. Some will just say, yeah, above 150, you're fine. Some will go down to 139. There's a reference range in Perth that's 139 to 651. Okay. So, but we know that below 308, you're losing 5% of brain per year. And you know what? The other groups actually lost some brain as well. So they were actually causing, because when you have that level of B12 or lower, you actually get demyelination of your axons. And so that can actually shrink the white matter and make your brain run slower. And so that's a very serious issue. And because B12 is required for myelination around your axons, which helps with the speed of conduction of your nerves and your thought, right? And the signals coming down from my brain to move my hand. When that gets slowed down, then the signal is slowed down, and you're just clumsier, and you just sort of can't grab things in the way. You're just not as coordinated as you should be. And so that's happening just because the B12 is a bit low, but because 75 to 80% of a Western diet, in terms of calories, comes from plants, and plants have no B12. Everybody's B12 deficient, but because those reference ranges are just the average for the community, and every few years they renorm the averages. And so as people get more and more B12 deficient, the average moves down lower and lower and lower. So it actually hides a lot of deficiencies. And so there's so many people are B12 deficient and have no idea, because it's right in the middle of that reference range that is far too low. And so when I talk to people, well, when you're just eating a carnivore diet, you're going to get a lot more B12. That just comes with the territory. And I always recommend people make sure that they check that and get up to optimal levels, which would be 800 to 1200 picomoles per liter, or in American terms, 1100 to 1600 picograms per milliliter. And you get into that reference range, you get your homocysteine below 7. Now you have enough vitamin B and substrate, and you need cholesterol, you need saturated fat, you need DHA, you need EPA. All of these things, well, most of those things will only come from eating meat. Choline, that's important for the brain. Creatine, that's required for the brain. Carnitine, that's required for the brain as well. All of these things only come from meat. And so when you're only getting 20% of your calories from meat, like, it's just not enough. And so we have not seen anybody recover from MS like that, not in the reported literature. And so there are people that have improved their situations by changing the way they eat, changing their lifestyle, and doing these sorts of things. But I couldn't find a single case report even of anybody that showed on MRI that lesions actually reduced. And that's what we're seeing again and again and again and again. And and the longer people go with this, the better they get. We have one guy who has been doing this for years, And he wasn't even full carnivore, he was just strongly ketogenic, heavily meat based. So he's getting rid of a lot of this junk and and eating a lot of meat and things like that because he looked at this analytically and just said, okay, what do we got to do? Okay, we got to reduce inflammation and how do we rebuild nerves? What are they made out of? Okay, they're all these building blocks, right? And so he did that, and now he's in his 50s. He's playing semi-pro volleyball. He's an executive at a Fortune 500 company, and his lesions had reduced down to nearly nothing. He had a 5 centimeter lesion on his brain stem when he presented, and he was basically going to be paralyzed fairly quickly. And now it's an eighth of an inch and just looks like a bit of scar tissue, right? That doesn't happen, right? And when you talk to neuroradiologists, they're like, yeah, we don't see that. We do not see these lesions go backwards. And so we have a neuroradiologist working with us. And he's like, yeah, that's just not something that you see. Now we're seeing it all the time. We're having about, 12 or 14 people in our case series just because after that it just gets too long. But I mean, we could do it with 50, we could do it with 100. I mean, easily. I mean, there are a lot of people out there that have already done this. And so it's quite remarkable, when you're seeing this sort of thing. And so, you know, it's yeah. I mean, I just think it's a very exciting time because we're actually seeing this in real life, and we're able to disseminate this information out there. We actually knew this in the 1800s. There's a book by Dr. J.H. Salisbury, who wrote a book called The Relation of Alimentation and Disease, and he writes the exact same argument that I have, which is we're eating the wrong food and it's causing these diseases. The issues come from the things that we put in our body. And this is long before glyphosate, is long before processed food and all that garbage. It's just eating the wrong thing, eating more plants and more wheat and more corn and more whatever instead of meat, which is what we're biologically designed for, and optimized for is the main thing.
Mm-hmm.
And he was reversing autoimmune diseases in the 1800s by putting people on a pure beef and water diet. So this is already well documented. There's books written on it. People took his work forward and used this for decades. People even call the Salisbury diet. It was just Salisbury steak. That's where that comes from.
Yeah.
It's named after him. And I've seen like stories where it was like, oh yeah, the Salisbury diet. That was the first fad diet. It's like okay, well, it's what humans have been eating for the last 2 million years. So by definition, that can't be a fad. Agriculture is a fad. It started about 10,000 years ago. Processed food is a real fad. I mean, that stuff only came into existence 100 years ago. Seed oils, refined sugars, all these things. That's a fad. Eating the way that we're eating now, that's a fad. What we need to go back to is before there was a fad eating, and can actually be healthy again.
Excellent. Well, you basically described what I was going to ask you anyway. Like we spoke about what you shouldn't be eating, and now you've slowly alluded to what we should be eating. Like we just a great analogy of the building blocks of what our neurons made out of in the brain. And so you're basically saying we get everything we need from meat and
Yeah,
nothing that we don't need. It's so simple.
that's it.
It's stupidly simple, and it can't be that easy. But you're in the firing. On the front line.
Mm.
You're seeing people with MS get spontaneous
Mm.
remissions, as I'm sure
Yeah.
like people will say that it's just some sort of spontaneous thing. Same with people
Yeah.
that end stage
Mm.
kidney disease, and all of a sudden that they're in remission, this spontaneous
Yeah.
remission. So, and
Well,
I'm sure it's the same root cause
yeah.
that can help a lot of these
Well,
autoimmune conditions.
I mean, first of all, autoimmune conditions can affect the kidneys, and that's a major issue. But the number one cause of kidney failure is diabetes, and we know that ketogenic diets, and the carnivore diet is a ketogenic diet,
Yeah.
have been shown in large scale human clinical trials to be able to reverse type 2 diabetes. And I've definitely seen that in my practice well before that publication came out by Virta Health. And now Virta Health has gone forward, and they've reversed over 25,000 cases of type 2 diabetes. The interesting thing about MS, everyone says, well, it's probably anything that happens differently. And people say, well, okay, hold on, what changed? Why are more people getting type 2 diabetes? Why are more people getting this? The excuse is it's probably always happening. We just didn't really notice it. It's just such a poor excuse because, that,
Yeah.
you can say that once. And they said that in the 90s. They said, okay, yeah, we're seeing all these diseases go up, but you know what? they're probably always happening with just a diagnostic issue. Okay, well, then why do they go up in 2010 and in the 2010s and the 2020s and or the 2000s and 2010s and 2020s? Every single decade is going up and up and up, and it's affecting younger and younger and younger decades of life. So no, you could say that once and that's it. And now we know that that's not true. The next thing that they're going to say is that, well, people are probably going into remission all the time on MS, and you're just happening to cherry pick these ones. Yeah, that's nowhere in the literature. And the thing with MS is that these people typically will get MRIs annually. And so it's not just like, well, most MS patients, they don't get follow up, and maybe this is happening all over the place, and they just get lots of. No, actually, like these people are predominantly getting followed up. That's best practice, is to have annual follow up or close follow up to check on things and see how things are going, and at least follow them and say, okay, how are things going? And the medications and et cetera, it's typically judged in how effective they are by if they're able to reduce the amount of new lesions over the course of a year and a half, 2 years. I have yet to find a study that says, oh yeah, we're going to look and see if this medication can actually reduce the number and severity of lesions. Like that, this is not something that they've even looked at as a possibility. And now we're seeing this. And now we're seeing this when people just change their diet, and we're seeing it a lot. And so that's something I hope will actually make a big impact on people and the way they think about this. Because if you're thinking about this and this is a disease process, and we just have no idea, it's just a weird disease like the plague, right? And we just have to, we don't know what the hell it is.
Idiopathic.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, idiopathic, meaning that we're idiots and we have no idea what the hell's going on, right? And so but if you think about that, it's like, okay, this isn't a disease. This is a toxicity, is a toxic exposure. We're being exposed to something, our body's reacting negatively to it. And we don't have the correct building blocks to rebuild our nervous system. And so we're not ever going to be able to combat this properly. That's a completely different approach. It's a completely different approach. Instead of just pumping drugs into people, which can be very helpful in certain circumstances, but it should be, like, as you say, the last resort or a fallback or an adjunct, something that helps you and helps doctors treat somebody, but it's not the treatment itself unless there's no other options. And now we're starting to figure out, hey, look, maybe there is another option. And if people see that, hopefully that will make them think about this. Okay, well, maybe we need to, it's not going to hurt you, eating the way the Inuit eat, eating the way the Maasai eat, eating the way that we all ate prior to the agricultural revolution, the way the Native Americans were eating up until 150 years ago when we killed all the bison in North America, or the Australian Aboriginals around the same time. So it's not going to hurt us, right? So first, do no harm. It's not going to hurt us. It is going to give you all the building blocks to rebuild your nervous system and the central nervous system, the structures of your brain, and your peripheral nervous system for that matter. And there's CIDP. This is sort of a similar process, but with peripheral nerves. And there are people recovering from that as well. So, okay, so it's not going to hurt people. It's going to give all these beneficial nutrients that could, at least maybe do something. And what do you know? Let's see. I think more and more people are going to start seeing this and start seeing that it works. And that's, and the publication like this case series is going to demand that someone, maybe us, maybe someone else, beats us to it. Doing like a larger scale human intervention trial, randomized control trial, just to actually show, is there a cause and effect relationship here, and can people really heal from this, and at what rate? How many people do this? Is it 50%, 60%, 1%, 2%? We don't know, but we are seeing people improve, and that's what's important. I think it's very important to investigate that further.
Fantastic. It's great to see how passionate you are about it. Obviously, you're right in the firing line, on the front line and everything, which is brilliant. And my whole premise for this podcast was to try and, almost a bit selfish, the questions. It was kind of like pushback questions that I'd had for the carnivore diet, but not like generic ones like cholesterol, heart disease, don't we need fiber, do we need vitamin C, stuff that's you're just beating a dead horse. Like, are we going to get colon cancer? Things that you're probably tired of talking about. So I tried to list a few things that were quite more like minutia, like nuance stuff, if that's okay.
Yeah, of
because
course.
my first question was going to be just basically about the carnivore diet in general, but you've really like hammered that home brilliantly, like what we shouldn't be having and then what we should be. So if anybody needs to go back over the hundreds and thousands now of videos, really breaking down just the basics of what a carnivore diet is, then they can do that. We won't dive into that as much, but in a nutshell, eat steak and don't eat anything else. Like that's the starting point. But we won't go into all that. This is going to be more like minutia stuff because I see a lot of carnivore videos which are great, but I feel like it's all the same sort of topics like protein to fat ratio, or do we need to fast, how many meals a day, do you know generic stuff.
Yeah.
And so my first question, which you've already like hit home with, you mentioned the Inuit
Mm.
a minute ago. So, so obviously, I'm a massive advocate for the carnivore diet. I've been doing it myself for probably since 2016, 17, around then. So these pushback questions these are more that I agree with the carnivore diet. This is just me playing devil's advocate. So
It's important.
I'm not trying to be inflammatory. Yeah,
No, no,
but
no. It's
so and
important.
it's
It's important to do that. You know,
yeah,
like we don't want to be in an echo chamber. We don't want to like avoid the hard questions and things like that. You know, it's important. Like it's, you know, if this is correct, then it should be able to stand on its own merits. We don't need to protect it. You know, it's like so go ahead.
yeah. So that's it because then some of these are just questions that I've been asked and some that I've asked myself.
Mhm.
So the first one, you might have heard this before, is so some people claim that the Inuit weren't actually in ketosis because they were having a lot more fresh meat with a lot more glycogen.
Mhm.
What would you say to those people, like in that stance, that they weren't ketogenic or fat adapted because they were getting carbohydrates from glycogen
Mhm. Yeah,
from the fresh meat?
yeah. I mean, my first response would be, who cares? Like, does that change anything? Does that change that
Mhm.
we're still supposed to eat meat and that you can still
Mhm.
thrive off meat and be as healthy as we can be off only meat? You know, the fact that there's glycogen in muscle and, you know, liver especially, you know, that's great. It's supposed to be there and we're supposed to eat it. So that doesn't change anything. It is a ketogenic diet, meaning that you're getting less than a certain number of grams of carbohydrates, and your blood sugar is going to stay low, and your insulin is going to stay low. And so what that I think it's a bit misnamed, just calling it a ketogenic diet. We name it after the fact that we see, you know, obvious raised you know, or obvious amounts of ketones, right? And so we call that ketosis. But really, what it is, it's an alternate metabolic state where your body is able to run on your fat stores, as opposed to just running on exogenous carbohydrates. You eat enough carbohydrates, it raises your insulin enough that it blocks lipolysis and you cannot burn fat. Okay, so that's a completely different metabolic structure. And so when you go to the other metabolic structure, when you're running on fat, you either can burn fat or not burn fat, and you have to burn carbs. So those are the different things. And in fact, the renaming and sort of reclassifying those two metabolic states as instead of a fed state and a fasting state, which when I was going through biochemistry, they were called it that. They call it now a carbohydrate metabolism and a non-carbohydrate metabolism. So Inuit are most definitely on a non-carbohydrate metabolism, and they can run on their fat. And I think that's probably even more accurate way of doing it, is that it's you know, because then it just sort of does away with the whole glycogen argument, because you can either run on your fat or you can't. And the Inuit can run on their fat. I mean, they're not getting all of their energy from the, you know, the amount of glycogen that's in there, and we stay in a state of ketosis even though there's glycogen. I mean, I eat meat every single day. There's glycogen in it. I have liver every now and then. You know, there's glycogen in it. But, you know, I don't care what my ketones are. I don't really, that doesn't bother me. You know, when we say that it has to be above, zero point 0.5, millimoles per liter of ketones in order to be in ketosis, or above one, and blah, 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 blah. It doesn't really matter what your ketones are, as long as you can make them. As long as you are actually able to make ketones, you're able to run on your fat. That's what's important. You can make blood sugar, glycogen, and ketones. And long-term ketosis, you get something called keto adapted, fat adapted, because when we're eating carbohydrates all the time, we're in that carbohydrate metabolism. Our body gets used to running on carbohydrates, even though most of our tissue do prefer ketones. And when you take even exogenous ketones, even if you have elevated blood sugar, two-thirds of your brain, your heart, your intestines, and many other organs will actually switch over to those ketones and use those when they have them. and then go back to glucose when they have to. So that's a preference. That's our primary energy source for most of your tissue, and then you make glucose and glycogen for the rest of your needs. You do have a use for glycogen and glucose, which is why we make it. You don't have to force yourself to make it in order to have enough. A simple fast is, don't eat for 5 days. Guess what? You don't die, right? You have plenty of blood sugar, and your blood sugar will be normal every single
Yeah.
day. Or if you're diabetic, it will be better than it was. And so when you're long-term ketosis, then your body starts using those ketones better. You start flipping on and off different, genes, have these epigenetic effects where, your body is actually expressing different proteins, and you use these ketones better. And so at first, when you go on a ketogenic diet, those ketones may be, 2, 3, 4, 5, higher. But as you go, you'll see those actually start coming down. And eventually, it's quite normal for someone in a long-term ketogenic state to have ketones below zero point 0.5. I don't check my ketones because that's not what I'm doing here. I'm not trying to have, win an award for the highest level of ketones. I'm eating proper food, and I trust that if I'm eating to my biological design, my body's going to work to its biological design, just like the Inuit are. They just eat food. It doesn't matter what their ketones are. It doesn't
No.
matter what's going on. That's a normal metabolic state. That's a normal food, and their body's going to work the way it normally does. And that's what it is. And when I do check my blood work, because other people have been interested, there's actually all these things were optimal. I checked my ketones once after about 5 years, sorry, 7 years, and of not having any carbohydrates outside of what was in glycogen from the meat and the liver, and it was zero point 0.4. Great. And my blood sugar was 84, or in UK terms, like was that 4.5, and my ketones were 0.4, totally normal. And I felt great, tons of energy. There's no problem there because I'm using those ketones. I'm making the same amount, but now I'm actually using them. And so that's that keto adaptation. So the Inuit, and I checked it. The only other time I checked it was actually the other day, and it was like 0.2. And
Mhm.
again, my blood sugar was just completely normal. Who cares? You know, um, Eat what you're supposed to eat. There's some glycogen in it. It's supposed to be there too. It's not a big deal.
Yeah. No, brilliant detailed answer.
Yeah.
Probably one of these straw man arguments that you get from the higher carb sort of crowd. I feel like it's just one of
Yeah.
those in
Well,
a way.
and yeah, and that's the thing. They're saying that the Inuit aren't in ketosis because they're at zero point 0.2, zero point 0.3, zero point 0.4 millimoles per liter. But what are we defining as ketosis?
Mhm.
The way I define it is you're able to run on your fat stores, and they are,
Clearly, yeah,
because they eat a whole bunch of muck tuck and blubber and things like that,
yeah.
and then guess what? Then that's what they're running on. They're running on that fat, and they're in very harsh environments. So if that's not optimal, like you're not going to do well. And the polar
Mhm.
explorers, the English and Americans, etc., that sort of explored up into northern Canada and towards the North Pole. The ones that tried to stay on like a traditional diet with like biscuits and breads and things like that, they all got very sick and had a
Mhm.
hard time. It was the ones that adopted the native diet of just fish, meat, and blubber, a lot of blubber. Those are the ones that survived and did well. And some of the ones that, and there's a campaign up in the into the Arctic that I read about, and everyone was doing amazing. And the rule was, hey, you got to eat this stuff. You got to eat what the Inuit are eating. And one guy was just getting sicker and sicker and sicker and sicker until he's just sort of bedridden. And they went through his pack and they found all these like biscuits and carbs and things like that. And he was horribly sick and he was malnourished and vitamin deficiencies and things like that because he was eating the wrong thing. And you can't do that in that environment and get away with it. And then they switched him back and just started eating him just fatty meat. And he recovered. He made a brilliant recovery. So I think those are a great example because there's no getting around the fact that they're just eating meat. Well, in the southern areas, they had lingonberries in the summer. Okay, wow. Okay, you really proving a point there. So, that the vitamin C that they get from a lingonberry for 2 weeks out of the year, that saves them from scurvy for the rest of the year. Like, no, I'm sorry, that doesn't work. Oh, but they could preserve, well, they could do anything, but they don't, and you're just making things up to try to fit your narrative. And there are people that live north of that don't ever have access to lingonberries. And so, whether they wanted to eat them or not, they don't have them and they don't have access to them. And then we know that people were living in the Arctic Circle during the ice ages, 1,500 miles north of what is now Seattle, and Seattle was under a mile-high block of ice. Okay, so how many berries and roots and tubers and honey and fruit are they getting in those conditions? If you needed those to survive or even be optimal, they're not going to make it. And we thrived. We absolutely became a dominant force on this earth during those times. And I think because of those times, and this is something that's long established in paleoanthropology, is that we started growing taller and bigger brains because our ancestors started eating meat. And when we got tools and were able to become apex predators, that's when we had this massive inflection point and an exponential increase in height and brain size, about 2.5 million years ago with Homo habilis. And Homo habilis didn't run away towards the equator when the ice ages started. Homo habilis went up north into the ice, right? So there's no getting away from that one. That's a classic one that they say, oh, well, people were going away to the equator to eat a whole bunch of fruit. And it's like, no, actually, the fruit eating ones, our early ancestors, the early humans that ate more plants, they all died out. It was actually the ones that went up north into the ice. Those are the ones that survived, and those were our ancestors, Homo habilis.
Excellent. Yeah, I think the argument that you need, say, like a certain vegetable to get this phytochemical or toxin, whatever we call it, I think it's just ridiculous because some of these products don't even grow on the same continent.
That's it.
So
Yeah.
whereas what is available worldwide everywhere, there's
Mm-hmm.
always some sort of fatty ruminant animal about. So
Mm-hmm.
that's if you just
Fish.
look at it from
Yeah.
just a common sense approach. Like you said, with some sort of little berry, that if that was an
Mm-hmm.
essential nutrient, it'd have to be everywhere, every
Mm-hmm.
continent. And then if you just look at it like from the zoom way out, that we've always got fatty ruminant animals all around us. And I think you mentioned earlier about we started with like these big woolly mammoth mastodons,
Mm-hmm.
and then we probably slowly hunted them to extinction. And now we've got smaller and smaller, like a cow, for instance. But I
Mm-hmm.
think just the logic of common sense there shows that that's probably got everything we need, and we don't need to be searching for this specific type of fruit with this strange enzyme or whatever's
Mm-hmm.
in there to make us healthy. But we've grown up around supplements with these special little amounts that people think you need all these things, and we've got complete nutrition in just a piece of steak, which to me and it's so simple, but
Yeah.
it's modern times as I think supplements and things like that and fads have really drawn us away from simplicity of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Definitely. Yeah.
yeah, so with the Inuit and ketosis and the glycogen side, it made me think about breast milk.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's probably a similar sort of answer I'm going to guess from you, that I was thinking that, okay, so if we're supposed to only have, say, like a teaspoon of, is it about 4 grams of glucose in our bloodstream at one time?
That's what we
Then,
naturally make. Yeah.
yeah, and it just made me think that, like, if when we've weaned off milk, that we should only be eating like a low carb ketogenic sort of diet.
Mm-hmm.
Why does breast milk have lactose in, which breaks down into glucose and galactose, I think it
Mm-hmm.
is.
Yeah.
So that made me think, like, why don't babies get cavities? Do you know, if they've got teeth and still breastfeeding, and why isn't that blood sugar detrimental?
Mm-hmm. So the kids need to be in ketosis, and so there is a lot easier for them to be in ketosis. Babies in the womb are in ketosis. Babies that are breastfeeding are in ketosis, even though the lactose is there. As they get older, and they really should be weaning onto their natural diet, which isn't necessarily just 6 months. I mean, that's like the minimum until they get their innate immunity and their body starts making their own antibodies and can defend themselves, and you don't need them from the mother's milk as much. But there's plenty of studies that show that, you breastfeed kids for longer than that, and they get benefits to IQ development and things like that. Is that because it's just the breast milk that's really beneficial, or is it because um, what they're weaning them onto is pretty garbage and isn't getting the right nutrients for them? It's hard to say. I think it's probably a bit of both, and there should be a good weaning time that that we see people come onto fatty meat. But as we get older, as people get past infancy, it starts becoming harder and harder for them to get into ketosis if there's carbohydrates involved. And kids need to be in ketosis because that actually helps the brain grow and develop. Like I said, 2/3 of the brain will only run on ketones as long as there are ketones available, and you make all the blood sugar you need. So if you just don't eat for 5 days, you're making ketones. You're also making blood sugar, but that's part of your brains are only running on the ketones, even though there's blood sugar available. So that's clearly a choice. That's a preference. So that's our brain's optimal preferential nutrient energy source. But also ketones cross the blood-brain barrier and reconstitute into fatty acids, which are actually used to build some of the physical building blocks and structures of the brain and nervous system. So you actually need this stuff, and you need that for the developing brain. So there's some sort of benefit to having carbohydrates as an infant, potentially. There's some sort of anabolic effect or growth effect, with the insulin, just getting a bit higher levels of insulin to get this energy into cells so that they grow and grow and grow quicker. Maybe, I don't think we know one way or the other, but they are in ketosis either way. And when they start getting to weaning age, that becomes not possible. So if they're drinking a lot of milk, they're not going to be in ketosis due to the amount of lactose in the milk. That's only during infancy. And then you get to the point of weaning, that's not possible anymore. And so you still need to be in ketosis, I believe, especially for a developing neurologic system. And so while there's likely a benefit, obviously, or else we wouldn't make breast milk in this way, to having, it's structured like that in infancy, it's not necessarily the same benefit to older animals, right? So when you look at mammals in nature, they drink their mother's milk until they're weaned onto the mother's diet, and then they eat that for the rest of their life, and then wean their children onto the same diet.
Mm-hmm.
So there is going to be that transition point. So this milk is extremely highly nutritious. Getting cow's milk, especially raw milk, is very different than homogenized pasteurized milk. But while it has exemplary nutrients, it's not necessarily like our perfect diet. It's just it's in comparison to what other people are eating, it's going to be extremely healthy. So it's a ton of really good nutrients, but it doesn't necessarily have perfect nutrition like fatty meat does. And so there's it's all relative. Things can be better than other things, but not necessarily optimal. And I think that's where milk lands.
Brilliant. Yeah, my thoughts were that it's obviously you're trying to get the tiny little mammal or baby to
Mm,
grow as quickly as possible. And
exactly.
I think what you alluded to with the insulin and the growth signals, and it's just like
Mm,
extra energy to
mm,
get this growing. But obviously, when you're fully grown,
mm.
you're not trying to keep growing, and that's probably when people start to store body fat if they're living off
Yeah.
milk with the lactose. That's what
Yeah,
I thought.
and it has other stimulating factors as well, like casomorphines, which tell it to eat more, and to put on weight, because babies are vulnerable. They get eaten. A lot of
Yeah,
most babies in the wild, they don't make it to adulthood. Um, Carnivores and herbivores, they just don't make it. And so even human babies have a very high infant mortality rate out in pre-agricultural,
mm-hmm.
you know, primitive, if you want to call it, societies. I think they have a lot to recommend them, but they don't have pediatric NICUs. They don't have, or pediatric ICUs and NICUs and things like that. And so if there's a problem, there's not much help for them, and they can get eaten. So yeah, so you have to get these babies growing as quickly as possible to get big and healthy and be able to run away from a lion.
Yep,
Yeah. But then
yep,
after that,
makes
you'll
perfect
be
sense.
putting on fat and things like that, and that's not necessarily beneficial to you. You just eat what you're supposed to eat, and your body's going to do what it's supposed to do.
Brilliant. Well, that sort of blends into my next question. That do you think, like, depending what you read, say like 3.5, 4 million years ago, we started eating meat and discovering fire and all that sort of thing. Do you think that we had a lot of raw milk available from these, like, say it was like these mastodon woolly mammoths? Would we have not? Do you not think we'd have come across a lot of milk? But then you read other places that we only sort of domesticated these animals, maybe is it less than 10,000 years ago, something like that, where we actually started mass
With
producing the
that.
milk.
Mhm.
So do you think we have? Do you think we didn't have much milk until more recent times, even if it was raw?
Yeah. No, yeah, I know. I don't. It doesn't seem that we did. When you took down an animal and it was nursing or something like that, maybe there was some milk there. Maybe they did something with that. Maybe they didn't. I mean,
Yeah.
lactase persistence um, seemed to have come into the genome about 10 to 12,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So and we saw it sort of spread from there. And so that conferred a survival advantage. The big megafauna had died out, like the mastodons, etc. And so we weren't able to hunt our normal prey. Some places were, in the Great Plains, they were going after bison. They were big enough and plentiful enough that they were able to do quite well, and other areas the same. But some places had to become pastoralists and sort of again get that sort of the next biggest animal besides an elephant, and domesticate it and use it for food and dairy. And so that's when we start seeing that about 10, 12,000 years ago. So the likelihood is that no, we weren't domesticating animals to get their milk prior to that, because we didn't need to. There's just plenty of big wild animals with plenty of fat. The larger the animal, especially when you're talking about ice age animals, when they're in these cold areas, they have a lot of fat, and they have more fat as a percentage of their body mass. And so those are the ones we went after. We went after the ones that were fatty. That was another argument that people make, that usually picked up by the vegans, that says like, well, yes, okay, people were hunters and we've been apex predators, but wild animals are very lean, and so it's still going to be lean meat. It's not going to be fatty meat. Like, no, the reason we moved to agriculture and to pastoralization and domesticating animals is because those big fatty animals died out. And so, we needed to get the fat somewhere else, which is why we started turning to butter and these sorts of things. We started turning to other sources of nutrition, because if you're just eating lean meat and nothing else, you can actually get protein poisoning. It's also called rabbit starvation. You have to get the majority of your calories. You really want to get your energy from something else, really from fat. If you're getting the majority of your calories from protein, that can actually eventually cause harm. And so you actually need something else, be it carbohydrates or fat. You just need your energy coming
Yeah.
from something else besides protein. You get some of it from protein, but if you're getting most of it or all of it from protein, that's a problem. And so, no, actually, we ate wild animals that were fatty, and we went after the biggest one we see. That's a big one. That's a healthy one. That's going to have a lot of fat. That's the one we're going to take out. You know, and that's what we did, and we're still doing it. So, um, yeah, that's yeah. All of these arguments have pretty simple and straightforward answers to them,
Yeah.
if people care to look.
No, excellent. Because it's like you said, with the lactase persistent, that probably sort of shows
Mm.
when we started
Yeah,
domesticating. If it happened along the same
yeah.
sort of time as that many thousand
Mhm.
years ago, that sort of makes sense.
And also, when people say, is like, well, if we're actually carnivores and we're meant to be eating meat, then why do we make amylase, which breaks down
I've got
starch?
that question. That was one
Yeah.
of my
Okay.
questions.
Well, it just tags on with this. The ability to make amylase and break down starch happened around the same time as lactase persistence,
Oh, okay.
right? And so with the death of these megafauna and the advent of agriculture, that's when you see it start spread in those areas, right?
Yeah.
And so you have amylase all of a sudden spread, and it spread widely. It really took off after that. But that's when and that's why.
A survival advantage, not
Exactly.
necessarily
Yeah. Yeah.
optimal.
That's it. And it's not something that we've been doing forever. It's not like,
No.
3 million years ago during the ice ages, we were just digging through, ice and tundra and trying to get through the glaciers to get at the root tubers that are like frozen in the ground there. No, we didn't do that. We didn't need to do that. And also, you have even if you had a persistence, let's say we had this for millions of years, we do have ancestors going back millions of years who were herbivores. And then 8 million years ago, they started eating meat and they started eating more meat. And that became a survival advantage and a huge evolutionary advantage. And in order to get that food, people, those animals had to become smarter and figure out tactics of getting this meat because they didn't have big teeth and claws, so their brains developed instead of their teeth and claws, and that's why we have big brains, and that's why we live in houses, and lions don't. Lions got the physical characteristics and the claws and the teeth that allow them to hunt. We have brains that allowed us to hunt, and now we can use those brains to do all sorts of other things, and that's the thing. And so, but if you have something like the ability to make amylase because we had it millions of years ago, unless there's an advantage to stop having it, it generally doesn't go away. It can persist. It's the color vision is like that as well. But we actually see a lot of people that, especially men, that are red-green colorblind. And like, oh, well, that's a disadvantage. Well, is it? Because people that are red-green colorblind are fully colorblind. They can actually see in low light situations, and they can actually see right through the shadows and the foliage and things like that. We have all these colors and this. You're walking through the woods and you're just seeing this wall of leaves. Someone who's red-green colorblind or just colorblind, they can actually sort of see through that. You have to see like, oh shit, there's an animal, there's an animal, there's an animal, there's an animal. They don't have that camouflage as much, and that's why a lot of different predators are colorblind. It's because animals and prey can't hide as readily in the foliage when you don't have that contrast. So actually we do see people start losing. I know there can be other advantages to seeing color, but we did see people start getting red green colorblind, and that actually has a huge advantage. And I've spoken to people, I've mentioned that on other podcasts, and you'll see a bunch of people in the comments saying, yeah, actually that it's a huge advantage. I can always, when I go hunting with my friends or whatever, like I can always see things way before anybody else can, and all these other sorts of things. So but with like the amylase, I mean, even if we did have it persistent for millions of years, was there an advantage to losing that? Not necessarily, but we actually do see that amylase came in around 10, 15,000 years ago and actually spread very quickly at that point, because it was a survival advantage, because it wasn't if you are in an agrarian society where you really are eating a lot of plants for better or worse, you better get adapted to them if you're gonna make it. And so the people that survived were the ones that had that amylase production.
Yeah. Ah, brilliant. Yeah, so it just shows that. I didn't know that about the color blindness. So it's a hunting advantage.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's well said that just because something like is it called a residual organ, like the appendix? Is that the right word?
Yeah,
Something that
or
stays. That's the
vestigial.
word.
Yeah.
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 So that's probably another good example. Just because something is still there, it doesn't mean it's optimal that we still do that with like the amylase, and like
Yeah.
we don't really. I don't think we need that part of the appendix anymore, because we're not fermenting food, like
Yeah.
fermenting vegetation and things like that. So
Yeah.
yeah, so you could probably use that for a lot of arguments. People say like, well, why do we have this? Why do we have, like, amylase was one of my questions. So that's a really detailed answer, and you could probably relate that to a lot of things that are still that we still have, but
Persistent. Yeah.
doesn't mean it's optimal. Like, I can drink milk and I'm not lactose intolerant, but does it mean it's optimal? Maybe not.
Yeah.
So no, that's excellent.
Exactly.
So next question's a little bit selfish for me, because I've got two small children. So I've got a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old, and it can be quite hellish between me and my wife, like what we feed our children. So she does respect me overall, that's my sort of field, and she's got her own expertise in other areas. But they're not full carnivore, and I'd like them to be if I could. But the number one at our list is she knows to look at ingredients, and if it has any seed oil in, she doesn't buy it. She knows that that's top of the ingredients. But we use So they'll have like ground beef or mince, we call it in the UK, steaks, or eggs. I make sure that is the base of every meal. But then the soup. My son's asked for a pudding, so he knows the word pudding because he's around children at school. So we use fruit and yogurt as that sort of thing. So my question was, do you think developing infants and kids need? I probably know your answer, but need
Mhm.
anything other than meat and eggs to be optimal?
No, I don't. And again, you look at what animals do in nature, including humans, which is they drink their mother's milk and then they're weaned onto their mother's diet and they eat that for the rest of their life, even from infants or from early childhood. People say like, well, what about the calcium and you need this and whatever. Okay, well, where do lions get their calcium? Right. So they get it from their mother's milk. Okay, where did the mother get it to put in the milk in the first place? It's not drinking someone else's milk,
No.
and it's just have this, a Robertus sort of worm that's just sort of eating its own tail. Everyone's just drinking each other's milk and passing around, calcium. Um, but so you're getting plenty from meat. I mean, the thing is that we misunderstand what is actually required because we have these RDAs that were established at a time, the recommended daily allowances that were established at a time when people were eating a mixed diet. And depending on what you eat, you need a different constellation of nutrients. You're going to need different nutrients to break down and digest and utilize different, or break down plant toxins and utilize different plant nutrients and things like that. But also, one of the major defenses that plants have are not just toxins. They make about 1 million different toxic chemicals, but they also have anti-nutrients. I think this is a major, major, major role that they play in being a disadvantage to us, is that they make things like phytic acid, oxalates, tannins, saponins, all these other sorts of things, lectins that can actually bind to different vitamins, minerals, proteins, fats, and denature them or bind them in ways that we don't have enzymes to break down. One counter to that was, well, but the bacteria in your gut can break some of these things down. Well, whoop-de-doo. That's your colon is well past where we can absorb any of these nutrients. So just because you freed up those nutrients in your colon, that just makes your poop more nutritious. So eat
Yeah.
that, I guess, um, but when you are
I'll
blocking
just
out,
turn this low. Sorry, it's getting
that's
dark in
okay.
the UK.
That's okay. So,
Just in case.
when you're eating, a mixed diet and you're eating these other sorts of things, you might get these things that block lipase and protease, and they inhibit those enzymes that would normally break down your protein and fats. And so you're just not able to break down and absorb the right amount of nutrients. And so if you're eating, meat, and they said, okay, well, you need, if you're eating plants and with oxalates and phytates and all these other sorts of things that can screw up your body's ability to process and absorb calcium, you may need a lot more calcium, right?
Mhm.
Okay, but what if you take all of those things out? How much do you actually need? Well, it appears that whatever's in meat, that's exactly how much you need, because we have people that are reversing osteoporosis by going on a carnivore diet. I mean, I have patients in their 60s and 70s, women in their 60s and 70s with florid osteoporosis, who after 8 months to a year of a pure red meat and water diet, just pure beef and water, they have the bone density of a 25-year-old on DEXA scan. So, and and so where is that coming from? Okay, well, a lot of it's from protein, things like that, but they're getting enough of the calcium. So, well, there's not enough calcium, and you're going to have a problem. No, there's actually not enough calcium if you eat plants. There was a study in the 50s that showed that spinach has a lot of calcium in it. Like if you just put it through a mass spectrometer, you actually see, okay, there are these atoms in there. Great. Um, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily bioavailable, that you can access them, or that it doesn't come with anything else with it that can be detrimental. So they gave people a bunch of spinach to see, hey, does this help bring your calcium up? And they found out no, it did not. It actually lowered their calcium levels. So, well, why the hell is that? Well, because the calcium is bound up in chemical bonds that we can't access, so it's not bioavailable. That's another way the plants defend themselves, is by protecting their nutrients in ways that we can't access. So this is why we ferment, we cook, we soak in different substances and chemicals in order to sort of break down these chemical bonds in order to make them more nutritious and lower their toxic load. That's how we've been preparing plants for thousands of years, because we've had to. We figured out through technology and an intellect that how we can actually get more out of these plants than they wanted us to get out of them, because they are not our natural diet. We are not biologically designed for these things, and so therefore we have to do something, manipulate them chemically or with heat in order, or ferment them, to do that, because we can't do it naturally. So that right there just proves, case in point, that we are not designed to eat them. This is not our natural diet. It's very clear. I mean, the fact that we have to argue this. I mean, I was taught that in second grade that humans are apex predators, and now people, no, humans have been herbivores. Like, really? Okay, all right. It's such a silly thing to say, but but these people with spinach, they actually reduced their calcium because the calcium in the spinach wasn't bioavailable. And they came with a high amount of oxalates, which is in the form of oxalic acid. If anybody had like rust on something, you put a bit of oxalic acid in warm water and you scrub it, the rust just comes off because it binds to you and strips off different things like iron, but also calcium. And so that gets into your bloodstream and actually strips out the calcium in your blood and lowers your calcium. And so then you have to start stripping off calcium out of your bones. This is another thing that some people, well, I think, perfectly reasonable thing to talk about, that, well, maybe there's some sort of, acidity, that your body's being slightly acidic, and you're going to have to buffer that with calcium. There's multiple buffering factors. It's not just calcium. But they're saying, okay, well, what if you're after you're buffering that with calcium, and you're sort of lowering your calcium levels, and you're going to strip that out of your bones, and over 20 years or something like that, maybe you're going to get osteoporosis, and maybe the old people, because they were having the blood and the viscera and those sorts of things, that got enough of this stuff. But just eating muscle meat, that's not enough. Okay, that's a an interesting argument, but we're actually getting better calcium levels in practice than people were getting before, just because we don't have that buffer effect. We're not eating things that strip out calcium. And so we don't actually need as much calcium. We're actually getting plenty of calcium, and we're not losing calcium. We're not stripping calcium. And again, I have patients that are reversing osteoporosis as opposed to getting it. So as a kid, it's really, really important to get all these sorts of things. And we say like, well, it's missing this nutrient, that nutrient, this other nutrient. And how's a baby going to grow its bones if you don't get more calcium? Like, well, how does a lion grow its bones? Because baby lions are weaned onto meat before they're fully grown. Most of their long bone growth happens after they've been weaned. So obviously they're getting everything they need from the meat, and it's not making them acidic, and they're not getting osteoporosis and all that sort of stuff. So, that's another thing too. If as Richard Feynman, the physicist, Nobel Prize winning physicist, said, it doesn't matter how beautiful your theory is, and it doesn't matter how smart you are. If it doesn't agree with the experiment, it's wrong. And the grandest experiment that's ever been done is life on Earth and evolution. And so, we can look at this, the largest randomized control trial that's ever been done. You see, all of the generations of animals, and we can see, well, that's not what happens. Okay, so that's a theory, but then you look, and if it doesn't fit the observed phenomena, that's nature's experiment. So if it doesn't agree with what we can see for a fact is happening, that's also not it's not going to be a correct theory. So yeah, you do get everything you need in the proportion that you need it, but particularly when you stop eating all the other things, that's very important. And just like with those polar explorers, when they started adding it, they were eating fish and meat and stuff as well, but they were also eating these sailors biscuits and all that sort of crap, and that actually hurt them, and it blocked out a lot of the absorption, and caused nutritional deficiencies that wouldn't otherwise be there.
Thank you. So I can show my wife this recording and
Yeah.
go from there. But no, it's great that again, early on in the podcast, we were speaking about, it's not just what you're eating, it's massively what you're not eating. And you've just
Yeah, it's really
shown with,
important.
like, obviously these anti-nutrients, phytic acid, oxalates, that chelate and
Hmm.
reducing your calcium intake. So it's
Yeah.
yeah, as you say, it's so important. Same with like if you're having glucose at the same time as vitamin C, things like that, your requirements change, and all these RDAs are probably based on a lot of unhealthy people. So it's just way out of whack. So it's just a great example of showing it's so important of what you're not eating because it's going to interfere with all your protein digestion, absorption, all these sort of things. So
Yeah.
no, that's fantastic. Um, so that this question as well with the fruit and the yogurts and the honey side, there's a massive growing space. Probably started in the carnivore community and slowly went to this animal based sort of. Obviously, you'll have heard of it. We won't
Hmm.
mention any names, but there's some big people in that space. And I'm sure I've seen conversations with you with people; those are very
Hmm.
respectful. Obviously, you probably agree on 90% of things, but then the 10% could be harmful for some people. Some people swear by that it's helped them. My question to you would be: do you think these big influencers, we'll call them, in the space, do you think they'll ever revert back to pure sort of carnivorous ways, and or do you think they've gone sort of too far? I sometimes think, do you think they're sort of lying how good they feel compared to when they were carnivore, or do you believe that they actually were getting negatives carnivore and now they've reversed them with carbohydrates?
Well, I mean, it's hard to say, what they'll do, but the thing is that, I've never been of the opinion that everyone has to do just one more, it's like I just don't care.
Mm.
My
Yeah.
whole purpose here is just to have people understand that meat is not the enemy, meat is not harmful. It is actually our evolved diet. That's actually what we require it, we need it. It's not good enough to just take supplements and things like that. You need these things, and there are a lot of things that we don't even know about yet that we need. Estimated that beef has about 50,000 essential nutrients, and most of these things we don't even have names for. So there's all sorts of things that we need, and even the phytonutrients. We're like, oh, but all these beneficial things in plants. Yeah, cows eat those. They filter out the toxins, and they actually concentrate the phytonutrients. So grass finished beef actually has more phytonutrients than the plants themselves. And so, my whole thing is just having people understand that meat is actually not the enemy. It's not harmful. It doesn't cause harm. It's not going to cause heart disease. It doesn't cause cancer because it doesn't, and it's not. And so, and that plants have toxins. I mean, that's just a fact. That's something that more and more people are understanding now. At first, they fought it and just said, "Oh my God, that's ridiculous. How can you say that?" And then they read a book and went like, "Oh shit, we've actually known about this for thousands of years." Okay, so is the entire. I mean, no one studies botany. I think I was probably the only person with a biology degree that probably took botany courses as part of that degree. Just doesn't interest most people, and so they just don't know. But you look in my videos and things like that when I talk about plant toxins specifically. There's actually botanists that weigh in there like, oh yeah, this is 100% true, and there are lectures online from botanists and professors of botany. Professor of botany from Cambridge University, Dr. John Parker, John Parker, he did a video on the Cambridge University YouTube channel called "Don't Eat the Plants," talking about how toxic they were and how it was a really bad idea to eat these things. And at the end, he concluded, this is in 2011. This is before any carnivore diet sort of happened. And he said at the end, okay, so what do we eat? What do we do? Well, you could eat some fruit, be a fruitarian, fine. But if you want real food with real nutrition, become a carnivore. That's what he said, right? So this is an actual botanist saying like this stuff is toxic, and they're not trying to be eaten. And I mean, so it's I mean, it's just a fact. And so just having people understand that, and just being able to go into this with a bit more understanding about the world around them. Meat doesn't cause harm and has all these nutrients that we have to have, and we are lacking. And those average reference ranges are hiding that fact that we're lacking these things as a population. And vegans say, "Oh, my B12 is fine." Bet you it's not. I bet you it's not. I bet you it's below 300, and I bet that's affecting your nervous system and your brain and causing serious damage. And we see this in neurosurgery. We see vegans, vegetarians, their spinal cord thins out. Dramatic. It's just blatant. We see this all the time. and this is something that I've spoken to with consultant neurosurgeons and professors of neurosurgery. They're like, yeah, that's a thing. That is a commonly seen
Hmm.
feature of that atrophy of the white matter in vegans and the spinal cords, etc. So it's just a matter of educating people. However people want to use that information is up to them, and I encourage them to try these things. One thing that I think can be difficult, and it's something I did speak to these people about, was that there are people that have serious addictive issues with sugar, and fructose is
Hmm.
addictive. It is an addictive substance, and people that have had those carb addictions, you know, what I have seen and what worries me is that they start eating fruit and they start adding some honey and it tastes good. And all of a sudden it gets that addictive sort of impulse back. And then a little bit of fruit and honey becomes more fruit and honey, and then it becomes a lot of fruit and honey. And then you start adding in other sort of carbs and this and that, and they just slip back to what they were doing before. And
Yeah.
I've spoken to so many people that they were like, that was me. Within 6 months, I was back on the couch. It was just slow sort of progression. It was like a gateway drug. And then, within 6 months, I was on the couch, put on 60 pounds, just eating pizza and drinking sodas, you know, and it just completely lost all the benefits that I had. If you're really active and you're outside and you're doing things in nature and you're eating fruit that's seasonal and local to you, it just sort of grows naturally by you, and there's a lot of benefit that you're bringing yourself. And so, you could do that. And if that brings value to your life and you enjoy that, go for it. I feel much better when I don't do that. And I feel much better in ketosis. And I do strongly believe that we have a benefit metabolically to being in ketosis. And that's something I did a video on. Is ketosis harmful? When we go for 2.5 hours, we go through the data and the literature and the arguments from Dr. Mercola and a guy named Georgi Dinkoff, who sort of in the Ray Peat school of thinking about how carbs are beneficial. Very similar, eating tons of meat, fat, all that sort of stuff, but carbs being important. I disagree, and I've had respectful conversations with Georgie and others about that, and as it should be. I mean, you can two people can look at the same information and intelligently and honestly come to different conclusions, and that's okay. It doesn't make
Hmm.
the other person a bad person. It just means that you have other sort of experiences that have influenced your view on this. And for me, I've just seen so many other studies that counter that. Longer term studies on ketosis following people for 24 months. And so they say, well, there's this one that followed people for 8 weeks and had this adjustment in their cortisol or this and their that. Okay, well, what about this one that went on for 2 years
Hmm.
and did not see that? I mean, it sort of normalized and actually was completely fine. Actually, things improved. Um, I think that's important to look at as well. But I don't know. I think that whatever was happening to them, I'm sure that they experienced what they experienced. But
Hmm.
was it because they were in ketosis? Was it because they were only eating meat and not eating fruit? Well, we know that the Inuit don't do that. We know that the people in the ice ages didn't do that because they weren't able to do that. Um, so we also know that the Maasai drink a lot of milk, and they do really well. So you can be really healthy, still eating a lot of meat, but also having some raw milk and these other sorts of things. I don't think it's as good. I don't think it's,
Hmm.
the best. Um, but I do think that it's a lot better than the alternative. And so they can still be very, very healthy. Um, but the thing that I think that people are missing with that is that some of these people were ketogenic carnivore for like a year and a half, 2 years, maybe. And then they started having these problems. And they put that down to carbohydrates. But that neglects the fact that there have been people that have been doing an Atkins diet, which is a ketogenic diet, like less than 10 grams of carbohydrates a day, and then full ketogenic diet, or even full carnivore diet, or even entire civilizations that have been carnivore. And they've been doing this their entire, for decades, or even their entire lives, generation after generation after generation. And they did not see any of these problems. They did not
Hmm.
see the issues that they did. So I had some speculation on what could be the problem and why carbohydrates would help. But either way, I don't think it was from being in ketosis.
No.
And that's really all it comes down to. It doesn't matter why. It just matters that, was it that? So they made the decision that Well, I'm going to add back in carbs and I feel better. Okay, great. But there are reasons for that. Like, if you're eating a lot of organs, if you're eating a lot of liver, um, and you can get hypervitaminosis A. High levels of vitamin A will suppress TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. So that suppresses your thyroid. It can suppress other things as well. And then eating carbohydrates actually raises your relative requirement and demand for vitamin A and other vitamins as well. And so if you were like slightly too much and that was sort of affecting you negatively over time, that could be a problem. And then you eat carbohydrates, and it raises your threshold, how much you need. All of a sudden now you're fine and it's not causing a problem. So that's
Mm-hmm.
one thing that it could be. But either way, I don't think it's ketosis because
No.
I was in ketosis for longer than they were at the time that they were having problems, and I was not having the problems they have. I still do not have the problems that they have, and I've been doing this for 7 years now, and 5 years in my early 20s. And again, entire populations that and civilizations generationally that don't have that problem. And I see this in my patients as well. I mean, I've been treating people with this actively for over 5 years now, and in a clinical setting. And I just don't see these problems. I don't see people's testosterone dropping off. I don't see their SHBG flying through the roof. My SHBG, steroid hormone binding globulin, that has been sort of low normal the entire time, and it really hasn't shifted. And I have no idea what it was when I first started this because I didn't check, but it's been low normal 2 years after I started and stayed the same the whole time. You know, and so my free testosterone is perfect. So there's nothing that I'm seeing, and I'm seeing 72-year-old men in my practice go carnivore and triple their testosterone levels, not the other way around, right? They're not suppressing their testosterone levels, and it's improving it. And it's persistent. I mean, I've got guys on TRT or that I inherited that were on TRT that all of a sudden their testosterone levels are just going up and they're going up and they're going up. And they're like, okay, well, we need to drop your dose, drop your dose, drop your dose, drop your dose. So for Australian numbers, the free testosterone levels that are optimal for a 25-year-old are between 600 and 900. Okay, so that's what you're trying to aim for. And I had one guy, and he's been on a carnivore diet for over a year now, and he's had high ferritin. He had to give blood donations every 2 months and all this sort of stuff. Now that's all perfect. It's completely normal. He hasn't given blood in a year, and he was on TRT, and his testosterone level had been 600, 700, something like that on the TRT. Last time we checked it, it was 3,200. And it was like, that shouldn't be there. I was like, was there a problem with you taking it? He's like, no, 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 no. I was just taking the normal amount and all that sort of stuff. So, okay. So, we rechecked this and we were like, okay, yeah, no, that was actually a legitimate finding. Okay. You need to come off your testosterone. You just don't need it anymore. And I've had other people, I've gotten so many people off TRT because their body just starts making it again. And so, if we're going the other way around, I should have seen it by now. It's been
Yep.
5 years. And so these people were getting these problems after 18 months, 2 years. I just don't see that, but I don't push organs. I check their bloods and be like, yeah, B12 is great. This is great. That's great. That's great. Have some liver every now and then if you want. You don't need it every day. Or people that are MTHFR and these things are a bit low, they're B12 and folate, things like that are a bit low. Okay, well, yeah, you probably do need to have some liver in your life, but a couple ounces, 2, 3 days a week, see what that does for you. Gets it up to levels. Great. That's all you need to go. And so, with that approach, things have worked just fine. And so, whatever's happening to them, I don't think it was the fault of ketosis. I don't think that, and so I don't think that it was a fault of ketosis. And, eventually, that there are people, not necessarily those influencers, but there are a lot of people who go down that path and find that no, they don't get as good of results and that it is actually affecting them negatively and they want to come back. And some people are perfectly happy there. And I'm fine with that. I want people to be able to make their own decisions and do what they feel is right for them. I certainly have my opinions, and that's why I lead my life the way I do. But I just, I want people to be able to have that choice and to be able to make informed decisions and not be scared of meat just because, we've been just hammered down that it is, because it just flat out isn't. And if they want to add some fruit and they don't get crazy and go nuts with it, great. In speaking to them, I sort of mentioned my concerns with that because I've seen that. And they even said there's just like, yeah, that's something I haven't figured out yet on those people that have those carb addictions, that's something that can be a problem, and so I think that people just need to really do some introspection and say like, oh, am I one of those people that have a problem with sugar, and will this become a bigger problem down the road? And if you are one of those people, it's probably best to avoid this stuff either way.
Excellent. Yeah. So especially what you said about the with the organs, with the
Mm-hmm.
hypervitaminosis sort of
Mm-hmm.
thing with vitamin A. So it's the carbohydrates. It's almost like a false positive in
Mm-hmm.
a way if it's helping that, but it's not because you had a carbohydrate deficiency. It's just
Yeah.
that you just yeah, as you explained. Just one sort of pushback linked to that. Um, Say with fruit and honey, why does it why does it taste so good
Mm-hmm.
if it's bad for you? And
Yeah.
do you think that's sort of linked to the amylase thing going on, that we kind of saw that as safe when we did eat that sort of stuff, but it were pushed upon us because we were running out of megafauna, and it wasn't um, millions and millions of years of evolution. It was more of a modern thing. Is that along them sort of lines?
So it's something called an evolutionary trap, where you have
Right.
something that sort of gives like a go signal, but is used outside of its original context, and then you can cause harm. So, a classic example of this is hummingbirds. And in the Midwest in the US, there were these little connectors for the electric fence. There were like sort of these red, sort of elongated, sort of plastic fasteners that sort of connected these electric wires for these electric fences for cattle, or for, so that the deer and things like that didn't get into people's crops. Um, Hummingbirds look at that, and this sort of elongated, sort of red thingy with a hole in it that looks just like the flower that they're supposed to get nectar from. So they go like, oh, okay, that's it. They go down there and they stick their nose in there, and psst, they get zapped and die. And so
Mm-hmm.
having all these hummingbirds that were dying from going in there and trying to get nectar from this electric fence, and then they changed it to yellow, because they wanted red flowers, not yellow flowers, and there's no problem, right? So that's called an evolutionary trap. There's something that's telling the brain, yeah, go do that, and it's actually hurting you. So fructose is addictive. That benefits the plant more than us, but it's saying, okay, hey, look, if you do this, if you do me a favor, and move my seed, I'll do you a favor. I'll give you some energy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'll give you some nutrients and all that sort of stuff. So, we understand this from an evolutionary standpoint, or from whatever standpoint, either biological standpoint, that there aren't any plants in nature that contain fructose specifically, which is why fructose is the sweetest of all the carbohydrates. Other ones are very mildly sweet at best. Fructose is very, very sweet. And we recognize that as sweet, we think, because we don't have any plants that we know of that are acutely toxic to humans that will kill you that day. They might be, have other sorts of things, coumarins. All citrus have coumarins, which can cause problems in your body, and other sorts of grapes have, tannins and things like that, and these are harmful. Grapes will kill cats and dogs, right? Okay, so there are toxins in them. It's just that things that contain fructose are less toxic to humans, a lot less toxic to humans. The fructose itself in large supply can cause problems metabolically. It's processed in the same way and broken down in the same um, byproducts as alcohol, ethanol. So we get same problems from ethanol metabolization, like fatty liver disease, cirrhosis, diabetes, heart disease, and so on and so forth. So when we saw this in nature, we said, okay, well, there's something, this is safe. We can eat this. We're probably, just starving, these sorts of things could definitely be a holdover to when we were, more herbivorous, but also it could confer a survival advantage that if we're not able to get meat, if we're not able to do this, so we're tasting things, oh, that's bitter. Oh, that's bitter. Oh, that's bitter. Oh, that one actually tastes okay. All right.
Mm-hmm.
So the ones that recognize that as safe, we're maybe able to survive more. And so that persisted. But now you've refined it. You've refined the sugar. You're getting highly concentrated amounts of fructose, and it just gives us, yep, that's safe. That's good. Eat that. And it does give a big addiction response. And we know this from MRI studies in humans that when you give somebody who's not addicted to any of these substances, a dose of amphetamines, like Vyvanse or something like that, Ritalin, that certain areas in the brain will just light up like a Christmas tree that hit that dopamine response in the reward centers in the brain, the addiction centers in the brain. And if you give that same dose of amphetamines to like a meth addict on MRI, that same spot barely twinkles. But then you give that same dose to a sugar addict, someone who's metabolically sick and been eating tons of fructose, same barely twinkle, right? So it kills the same areas of the brain as meth to the same extent as meth, right? It may take different
Mm-hmm.
amounts of time, but it gets there in the end. And unlike illicit drugs, alcohol, meth, things like that, there's no real limit on the amount of sugar that you can eat. You'll get too messed up from these other drugs that like you'll have to stop or you'll die. Whereas with sugar, you can just keep pounding that in all day. I mean, when I was like 10, we went to Costco for the first time. We moved up to Washington State, and that was where Costco started. And we found a 10-pound bag of gummy bears. I'm like, yes, let's get that. I finished this thing in like 2.5 days. 10 pounds, and I didn't even like it. I didn't even enjoy it. I was just like, oh God. I was just playing video games, just eating handfuls of gummy bears. I just couldn't stop. I could not stop.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't even taste good to me anymore, but I couldn't stop. And I literally couldn't stop. And I just was just like, okay, I'm just gonna finish this stuff and just get this the hell away from me. And thankfully we weren't in a household where that was commonly available, or else that would have been trouble. Um, but those so these things are addictive, and they give that response. And so in small amounts, in fruit in nature, it's not the same fruit that we've cultivated now. The fruit that
Mm-hmm.
we have now is so much more sweet, has so much more of the fruit part, the juicy fruit part. Before they had a lot of seeds, very mildly sweet at best. Like a crab apple, which is like a natural apple. It's quite tart. It doesn't even taste sweet, but it doesn't taste bitter. And so, that bitter taste, that's your brain warning you, hey, look, that's bad. Okay, so we're trying to taste things and like, okay, well, it's not great, but it's not going to kill me, and I can eat this and I can survive. Or there might be something that's a bit mildly sweeter, and you get that, but it's only available for 2 weeks out of the year, right? Because then it's right for this period of time. You eat it, and maybe that gives you a bit of insulin resistance and helps and puts on a bit of fat, and then you go into winter with a bit of fluff on you. Probably a good idea, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But again, when you have people living generation after generation for hundreds of years, thousands of years in the Arctic Circle during the ice ages, there's no fruit at any point at any time, and there's certainly no honey. Honey, before we developed fire and figured out that you could smoke out bees, and we don't know when that happened as far as figuring out the smoke part of it. Um, Honey was not accessible.
Mm-hmm.
That was not part of our diet, because you get stung to death, trying to get in there like a bear can do. It's got thick hide and all that sort of stuff. It's going for their eyes, going for their nose, trying to get in their mouth. But bears can get in there. We don't have that protection. So until we had beekeeper suits and smoke to calm down the bees, that really wasn't an option. And so it's and also is this something that we're going to get every single day, all day? Or is this like a treat, like, ooh, hey, that's a treat. We can get this, and we can survive, we can get energy. And so being a survival advantage does not necessarily make something optimal. It's just
Mm-hmm.
that, okay, during this time when we're having these lean times, we can survive on other things. Lions can't. When lions don't get a kill, they die, right? We don't. We were able to go to other sort of means because we came from a more recent herbivorous background, you know, unlike lions and felines and wolves and things like that. They've been carnivores just going way back. And so, we have an advantage there. So when times are tough, we can survive on certain things, but that doesn't mean that that's optimal.
Mm-hmm.
And then we get into these evolutionary traps. You say like, oh, that's good, that's safe, that's some good energy, but now we have it refined. We have bags of it that
Yeah.
you can have available to you. And, that was one thing that said, well, if it was really addictive, then people would just be eating scoops and spoonfuls of sugar. First of all, people do that.
Yeah.
And second of all, you don't need to do that, because you have all this candy and bullshit that's all that is, like a hard candy, that's just boiled sugar,
Mm-hmm.
gummy candy, all that stuff. It's nearly pure sugar with some flavorings and things like that make it even more enjoyable and addictive and things like that. So, the processed food companies are not stupid. These are not dumb people. They're
No.
quite nefarious, and they understand. They've had thousands of very, very intelligent food scientists that make things as addictive as possible. And they even talk about this. I saw on 60 Minutes. They said, yes, we want to take, just want to say, like, natural flavorings. Whether that means it tastes like something natural, not that it came from nature,
Mm-hmm.
right? And just because something came from nature doesn't mean it's necessarily good for you. But that's not even what it means. But people think that's what it means. Oh, it's natural. It's natural flavorings. Like they used actual orange juice. No, they did not. They took some of those compounds that taste like oranges, and then they changed it, manipulated it, so it gave an even bigger taste expression, and then went away really quickly. And they said this specifically on 60 Minutes. So they want that big explosive flavor that goes away quickly. So you want the next bite, you want the next sip, you want the next thing, so that it sells. So it causes a compulsion, and you eat more of the product, so that they sell more of the
Make more
product.
money.
Like any good drug dealer, you have to make this addictive because the money's on comeback.
I was
The
just
more they
about to
come
say
back, the more they
that.
have. That's it. And so that's what they're doing. And it's the same exact tactics as like a high school drug dealer in a cartel.
Legal drugs.
Yeah, and the tobacco industry. That's something people don't realize. Tobacco industry spent decades trying to make their product more and more addictive, so people smoked more and more and more and more and more, and became more harmful and more compulsive. And then when they got busted for that, and they got fined $400 billion back in the '80s for lying about how addictive and harmful their products were, and even though they knew that it was, they then diversified. They were the largest companies in the world that had just massive, massive treasure trove of savings, and they bought up some of the largest processed food manufacturers in the world, including Kraft and a few others, and they became the largest processed food manufacturer on earth. And they then moved their scientists over, and they started getting people into the food sciences to now, instead of making cigarettes as addictive as possible, making the food as addictive as possible. And it worked. It really worked. And then the other
Mm-hmm.
processed food companies started following suit, because they were just cornering the market on all of this food. People were just going crazy on it. And now we're going back, people are, vaping, this and the other. Those bastards are still in it, getting people addicted to nicotine. And they had all these studies and things like that coming out about how, smoking was fine. It wasn't a problem. Didn't cause, emphysema or cancer or blah, blah, blah. It wasn't addictive. And now you've got people coming out with studies saying, oh, nicotine is actually, like a superfood. It's like, it's like, it's good for your brain, and it melts cancer and all that sort of bullshit. And it's just like, okay, maybe it does, but like, I'm sorry, I've just got to be a bit cynical and skeptical about this, because like, who's paying for that? Who's running a multi-million-dollar study that extols the benefits of nicotine? Could it possibly be the nicotine manufacturers? Because they've already done this before, and Coca-Cola alone in 2015 spent $119 million on nutritional research in 1 year, right? The processed food industry as a whole spends about 11 times the amount of money on nutritional research than the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, who spends about $2.2 billion on nutritional research. So, this is a massive, massive, massive cover up. And they're trying to cover up the problems with their products and actually come out with studies that say, oh, actually, it's good for you. And this is why people say, like, well, there's all these studies that show that seed oils are fine and sugar is safe and all that sort of, or even that seed oils are good for you and beneficial. And this is just fear mongering. Where are these studies coming from? Who's paying for them? Got an idea? And who's coming up with the money for the tobacco, the studies. And a lot of these people, they don't necessarily telegraph that this is where the funding comes from. The sugar industries, the tobacco industries, they certainly sugar industries, they've been paying off people for decades
Mm-hmm.
under the table, and not saying that they were paying these people off, and these people weren't telling people that they were conflicted and had conflicts of interest, and that the funding for their studies were coming through a series of shell companies that actually originated from the processed food industry. So that's been happening for decades. The Journal of the American Medical Association, is the top medical journal in the world, published in 2016 the actual internal memos from the sugar companies back in the '60s, detailing how they were doing this. And in that particular set of documents, they detailed how they paid off 3 Harvard professors to falsify data and publish fraudulent studies to make it appear as if cholesterol caused heart disease, when it's much more likely to be sugar. And they were trying to defend sugar because a lot of people were coming after sugar. And one of those, and they even said that sugar was safe and it was just an empty calorie and it's all good and all that sort of stuff. And one of those professors was named head of the USDA, and he was the one who authored and published the USDA declaration saying that cholesterol causes heart disease. And everyone should stop. And they paid off Ansel Keys, who did the Seven Nations study, and Ansel Keys said, hey, you should cut out fat. Maybe it's a problem, maybe it's not, but you know what? It's not going to hurt you to cut it out and just replace those calories with sugar. Good old sugar. It's just an empty calorie, and you just get that energy because you need it from somewhere. The interesting thing is that his Seven Nations study, which he actually cherry picked those 7 nations. It was actually a 22 nation study. He had complete data for 22 nations that didn't show any correlation between cholesterol and cardiovascular disease. But if we look at those, it sort of had this increased risk, this parabolic curve of increased risk as you increase cholesterol and increase cardiovascular disease, has something called an R value, a relative risk association from cholesterol and cardiovascular disease. There's that like 0.8, like 0.86 or 0.84, something like that. And his conclusion, and the conclusions of the other people that were paid by the process, the sugar companies, which we know now they were, was sugar's safe, sugar's fine, replace fat with sugar. In that 7 nation study, that he concluded you should replace fat with sugar, the R value for sugar, the relative risk association with sugar and heart disease, was exactly the same. It was like 0.86. It was exactly the damn same. And yet they concluded that fat's bad, cholesterol's bad, probably causes heart disease, sugar's safe, replace it with sugar, even though it's exactly the same risk assessment. And that's why correlation is useless, these correlative studies. Mm-hmm. Correlation cannot prove causation. But you know that it's fraudulent. You know these people had bad intentions because they had the data right there. They knew that sugar, by their own data, was at least as bad as cholesterol, as they were trying to make cholesterol out to be. And you had to cherry pick that. If you had the 22 nation study, would that have been even higher? That would have likely been a much higher R value than cholesterol for that. And yet the conclusion was eat sugar instead because we were being paid to say it. And so, are we seeing that now with these nicotine studies? We're certainly seeing that with the processed food industry saying that sugar is safe and seed oils are safe and artificial sweeteners are safe and all this junk food garbage, chemicals that never existed in nature and certainly not in the abundance that we're seeing them now, that they're safe and probably beneficial and better for you than the natural alternative of meat. And by natural, I don't just mean it exists in nature. I mean, that was our natural diet. That was what we've been eating since humans have been humans. And there's an immutable law of biology, which is that of adaptation. Of what a species has been adapted to the longest is what they're most used to and what is most beneficial for them, and what is safest for them. And that's just how biology works.
Fantastic. Well, I didn't think I'd have enough questions to fill a good amount of time, but
I talk a lot.
No, it's brilliant. No, it's a great thing. You really elaborate, and you just give us so much more knowledge and little nuggets of truth and logic within one question, so that you've covered a lot of things, and it's been fantastic. And hopefully, I'll get a few viewers. It's my first ever podcast,
but sure.
It's no. Every question you've just not gone off topic, just added to it fantastically, and you've answered a lot of things that I were going to ask you. I was going to ask you about testosterone, and you've already gone into that. My dad wanted to know about that.
It gets better.
That was great. I didn't need to ask you that. And yeah, just don't want to take on any more of your time. And I really appreciate you coming on and being my first ever guest. Hopefully, I'll be able to get more carnivores on, and yourself, hopefully, in the future. And yeah, covered everything I wanted to ask and more. So really, and I just think you're really good at explaining things, even though there's a lot of sort of like a lot of physiology behind it, but you don't have to have like a master's in biology to understand what you're saying. you always revert it back to like logic and like what would a lion do in the wild and just make it really digestible for the layman sort of person. So really appreciate
Mhm.
that, and
Oh,
it's I think my audience will appreciate it, hopefully
yeah, I hope
as
so.
well.
And yeah, no, you're very welcome. And I hope they do. And you shouldn't need a master's degree in biology and physiology or nutrition. Nature is just natural. It happens all on its
Yeah,
own. And if it doesn't, that means there's something wrong. And so, we should be able to be healthy and be able to eat the right thing without having somebody with a degree telling us what to eat. It should make sense. We should be able to just eat, have it taste good, and be able to self-limit. Our body just says, yeah, it tastes good now. Now it doesn't really taste good, and I want to stop. That's what animals do in nature. They eat as much as their body tells them to, and then they stop. And so it's abnormal that we wouldn't know how to limit
yeah,
the amount of what we eat. People say, well, animals in the nature, they're running around, they're always active. That doesn't explain animals in the zoo that they're confined, they're not moving around, but they're ripped. They look like they're on steroids. I've never seen a fat zebra or a fat giraffe,
no,
let alone a fat lion. And that's because if they're being fed what they're supposed to eat, then they are going to, just be what they're supposed to be, even without exercise. Now they exercise, they'll be even healthier. But koalas don't get much exercise. They don't have natural predators in the wild. They get as much exercise in the zoo as they do in nature, and they live in trees that are made out of their food source. And yet they don't overeat. You say in the zoo, like, well, they're limited, they're just given just the right amount. Okay. But you have you say in nature it's really a lack of resource. Actually, there's a lot of animals that have an abundance of resources. And koalas are one of them. They just live in a tree that's made out of their food, and they just eat as much as they want to, right? And then something tells them to stop. And
yeah,
when a lion takes down a gazelle or a buffalo or something, King Lion gets to eat before any other animal touches it. So he gets to eat his fill. And then when he's done, the rest of them come in. And so why doesn't he just overeat and overstuff himself and gorge until he's just puking out and fatty meat and things like that, and just be like, oh my god, and getting fat and obese? Why is that? Why because something in him tells him to stop. Something in him tells him this is how much you need and no more. And so if we can't do that naturally, it's probably because we're eating the wrong thing. And I think that's just a better way of thinking about it. It should just make sense. Like koalas don't need somebody with a PhD in nutrition to tell them what to eat. They just know. And we're the only things that don't know what the hell to eat. And we're going against, what we know that humans have been eating the longest. And it would make perfect sense that we would have those natural, benefits and instincts from. And when people go back to that, eating a biologically appropriate diet, we start to see that people are able to just eat intuitively, eat as much as their body's telling them to, and just stop naturally. And so, I just, yeah, hopefully, well, not even hopefully, I know more people are coming to this because it does work and it does happen. And so, thankfully more and more people are coming to it because it's helping a lot of people. And then they get those benefits, and the people around them say like, hey, I want some of that. And then they start doing it themselves. And that's why this is spread all over the world as a grassroots movement over a relatively few number of years. And but it does work. And that's why now we're seeing more clinicians and doctors and nutritionists saying there's something to this, and I want to do this with my patients, and now you're getting even greater effects. So it's really good to see. So more than happy to be on as a
Ex-
guest. Hopefully it helps.
no, excellent. And again, just comes down to common sense. A lot of things, but people have they can't see the forest for the trees, sort of thing. But I
Mm-hmm.
think you've explained it brilliantly. Where can people find you, Doctor Anthony Chaffee?
Yeah.
Social
So
media.
yeah, I have a YouTube channel. It's just my name, Anthony Chaffee, MD, same as Instagram, and I have a podcast called The Plant Free MD, and that's where you can get all of the podcast versions of my interviews and videos. And yeah, and then Twitter's X is Anthony underscore Chaffee, and you can sort of find the rest of them through those things. Really on Instagram, there's like a link tree. It has all my other links in there as well. But YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and my podcast are the main ones.
Brilliant. Right, if we wrap up there, if that's okay.
Sounds
And
good.
yeah, thank you again, and hopefully we
Mhm.
can do it again sometime.
Sounds good, man. Looking forward to it.
Thank, thank you.
Thanks.
Excellent.